I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA found something to complain about. They always did. But even I wasn't prepared for the ridiculous accusation that landed on my doorstep one humid Monday morning. A crisp white envelope sat in my mailbox, stamped with the dreaded HOA logo. I tore it open right there, standing in my driveway. My eyes skimmed the letter and I felt my pulse tick up. Violation: excessive vehicle parking on HOA property. Penalty: increased monthly fees by 50%. I let out a short, humorless laugh. HOA property. That was rich. I folded the letter and walked back inside, shaking my head. I knew exactly who was behind this: Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president and the self-appointed ruler of our neighborhood. She was a middle-aged menace with an ever-present clipboard and a nose for violations. I had tangled with her before, but this was a new low. The accusation was ridiculous. Sure, I had a few cars: my pickup, my sedan, and my nephew Oliver's old classic he was restoring, but they were all parked neatly in the lot adjacent to my townhouse. A lot that, unbeknownst to Margaret, belonged to me. She must have assumed the HOA owned the parking lot, like they did the tiny park at the end of the street. But they didn't. I did. And that little detail was about to blow up in her face. For now, I played it cool. I needed proof of her overreach before I struck back. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I went to the next HOA meeting, ready to let Margaret dig her own grave. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige building that smelled faintly of coffee and bad decisions. Margaret stood at the front, her sharp gray bob perfectly in place, her expression smug as ever. She barely glanced at me when I took a seat near the back. It wasn't long before she brought up the issue of excessive vehicles. "I've received multiple complaints," she announced, adjusting her glasses. "Certain residents are abusing community parking spaces, and it's become an eyesore. As such, we've decided to implement additional fees for those exceeding the vehicle limit." I raised a hand, my voice steady. "And who exactly are these fees being applied to?" Margaret's lips curled into a tight smile. "You, Harper." The room went silent. A few of my neighbors shifted uncomfortably. "Interesting," I said, crossing my arms. "Because last I checked, that parking lot isn't HOA property." Margaret blinked. "Of course it is." I pulled out a folder from my bag and slid a document onto the table. "No, it isn't." She hesitated before picking up the paper. As her eyes scanned the deed, the one with my name listed as the legal owner, her face paled. I leaned forward. "You raised my fees over too many cars on land that I own." "That's extortion, Margaret." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Some people were already whispering to one another, clearly realizing just how badly Margaret had overstepped. She cleared her throat, feigning composure. I was under the impression that—" "You were under the wrong impression," I cut in. "And now we have a problem." Margaret's grip on the document tightened. She wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not in front of an audience. "Well," she said stiffly, "we'll have to review this." "Oh, you'll do more than review it," I said, standing up. "Because if you don't rescind that fee immediately and issue a public retraction, I'll be taking legal action." Margaret's jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. She had been caught, and everyone in that room knew it. I walked out of the meeting with my head held high, but I had a feeling this wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the type to back down quietly. If she couldn't control me through fees, she'd find another way. She had started this fight. Now I was going to finish it. Margaret didn't waste any time. Less than 24 hours after the HOA meeting, I spotted her skulking around the parking lot, clipboard in hand. Eyes scanning every inch of the pavement like she expected to find some hidden loophole that proved I was in the wrong. I stood by my truck, pretending to check my tires as I watched her from the corner of my eye. She walked the perimeter of the lot, tapping her pen against the clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she did something that made my blood simmer. She took out her phone and started snapping pictures. That was enough for me. I stepped away from my truck and made my way toward her, keeping my expression neutral. She must have heard my footsteps, because she turned abruptly, her face rearranging itself into a saccharine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Harper," she said, voice dripping with forced politeness. "I was just doing a routine inspection." I folded my arms, glancing at her phone. "Didn't realize my private property was part of your routine." She gave a light chuckle, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her irritation. "We like to ensure all areas adjacent to HOA-managed land are kept up to community standards." I let that statement hang in the air for a beat before responding. "So the HOA is now in the habit of monitoring land it doesn't own. Interesting policy." She stiffened, but before she could reply, a familiar voice called out from behind us. Oliver, my nephew, emerged from his car, wiping grease off his hands with an old rag. He glanced between us, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right here?" Margaret's gaze flickered to Oliver's car, a classic muscle car that had seen better days, but one he had been restoring for months. She pursed her lips. "It's come to my attention that certain vehicles in this lot may not be in compliance with community aesthetic standards." Oliver let out a low laugh. "Aesthetic standards? It's a parking lot, not a country club." Margaret ignored him, her attention snapping back to me. "Unregistered or inoperable vehicles are not permitted in visible areas. If this car isn't moved soon, we will have to escalate the matter." I tilted my head, genuinely curious. "Escalate how? You have no jurisdiction here." Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. "There are community guidelines that extend beyond direct property ownership." I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough to let her know I wasn't playing around. "Margaret, you are grasping at straws. You tried to find me over this lot, failed, and now you're finding a new excuse. I own this space. I can park a spaceship here if I want." She inhaled sharply, visibly frustrated. "We'll see about that." With that, she pivoted on her heel and marched off, her heels clicking against the pavement. Oliver shook his head, whistling low. "She's not gonna let this go," I exhaled. "I know." Margaret's next move came quicker than I expected. By the following morning, a bright orange tow notice had been slapped on Oliver's car, citing abandoned vehicle regulations. It was laughable his car wasn't abandoned. He worked on it daily. I yanked the notice off and crumpled it in my fist. I wasn't just dealing with overreach anymore. This was outright harassment. I pulled out my phone and made a call to a real estate attorney I knew. If Margaret wanted to play dirty, I was going to hit her with something she couldn't ignore legal repercussions. A few hours later, I had a plan in motion. First, I filed a cease and desist letter against the HOA, citing unlawful interference with private property. Then, I made sure to post clear signage at the entrance of the lot, explicitly stating that it was privately owned and not subject to HOA regulations. That should have been enough to make Margaret back off, but she wasn't just persistent, she was desperate to reassert control. By the end of the week, she escalated her tactics. A tow truck rolled into the lot early one morning, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. I was already outside, sipping my coffee on my porch when I spotted it. I set my mug down and strode toward the driver who was stepping out, clipboard in hand. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The driver glanced at me, then back at his paperwork. "Got an order to remove an abandoned vehicle." I didn't even have to ask who issued it. "That car isn't abandoned, and this lot isn't HOA property." The driver hesitated. "Margaret Whitmore said," I cut him off. "Margaret Whitmore has no authority here." I pulled out my phone and held up the property deed. "This is private property. If you touch that car, you're trespassing." The driver frowned and scratched his head. "Look, lady, I'm just doing my job," I nodded, "and I respect that. But if you tow that car, you'll be complicit in a legal property seizure." That got his attention. He muttered something under his breath and pulled out his phone. A moment later, he sighed. "All right, I'm out. You got a problem, take it up with your HOA." "Oh, I will." As the tow truck pulled away, I spotted Margaret watching from a distance, her expression thunderous. She had lost this round, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. This was far from over. Margaret didn't take her loss quietly. By the time the tow truck retreated, she had already stormed back to her house. I knew she wasn't giving up. She was regrouping. The thought of her poring over HOA bylaws, searching for a way to strike back, almost made me laugh. Almost. I wasn't taking any chances. That evening, I installed a few security cameras overlooking the parking lot. If Margaret or her lackeys tried anything underhanded, I wanted it recorded. Oliver helped me set them up, muttering under his breath about HOA busybodies with too much time on their hands. The next morning, I woke up to something new, a notice taped to my front door. Unlike the previous ones, this wasn't a fine or a violation, it was a summons for an emergency HOA board meeting. The topic: unauthorized use of community spaces. They were going to try again. I wasn't worried. If anything, I was curious to see what ridiculous argument Margaret had cooked up this time. The meeting was held in the same community center as before, but this time, the tension was thicker. A handful of residents had shown up, most of them looking uncomfortable. Margaret stood at the front, flanked by two board members, her expression tight with barely restrained smugness. "As you all know," she began, her voice carefully measured, "we've recently encountered an issue regarding improper use of shared community spaces." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, waiting for her to get to the point. She continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "After reviewing our HOA guidelines, it has come to our attention that while the parking lot in question may be privately owned, its continued use as an unregulated storage area for vehicles negatively impacts the aesthetic and property values of our neighborhood." I let out a slow exhale. So this was her angle. If she couldn't claim ownership, she'd try to control how I used my own property through vague claims about community standards. Margaret cleared her throat. "As such, the board is considering a motion to petition the city for an ordinance restricting non-HOA compliant parking lots within our residential district." That got my attention. She wasn't just overreaching, she was trying to bring local government into this. I stood up. "So let me get this straight. You tried to fine me for using my own property, failed, then tried to have my nephew's car towed, failed again, and now you're trying to rewrite city ordinances to get your way." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't personal, Harper. This is about maintaining the integrity of our community." Several neighbors shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with how far this was going. I glanced around the room before speaking again, making sure I had everyone's attention. "Let's talk about integrity then." Because I did some digging of my own. I reached into my folder and pulled out a printed document. "You see, Margaret, when you started harassing me over this parking lot, I decided to check the HOA's financial records. Publicly available ones, of course." Margaret stiffened. I continued, flipping through the pages, and what I found was interesting. Specifically, the way certain HOA funds have been allocated over the past 5 years. The room fell into an uneasy silence. I paced slowly, reading from the document. "It seems that a significant portion of HOA fees have been funneled into administrative costs. But when I cross-referenced those expenses, something didn't add up. For instance, last year, the HOA reported nearly $20,000 spent on legal consultations, but there's no record of any lawsuits, disputes, or filings that would justify those expenses." Margaret's jaw tightened. "That's confidential board business." I raised an eyebrow. "Is it? Because according to HOA bylaws, financial records must be accessible to residents upon request. And when I requested a full expense breakdown, I was denied access." A murmur rippled through the room. Homeowners were starting to whisper among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. I pressed on. "So here's my theory, Margaret. You've been using HOA funds for something. Maybe personal expenses, maybe shady deals, I don't know yet. But what I do know is that you got sloppy." And now, instead of admitting you made a mistake with my parking lot, you're trying to distract everyone with a fake ordinance push. Margaret's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, one of the board members, a middle-aged man named Tom, spoke up. "Is this true, Margaret?" His voice was sharp, suspicious. Margaret's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. "This is a gross mischaracterization of our financial processes." Tom frowned. "Then show us the records." "If there's nothing to hide, that shouldn't be a problem." Margaret hesitated. "That was all the confirmation I needed." I turned back to the room. "I've already contacted a financial auditor. If anyone else here wants a full review of where their HOA fees are going, I suggest we submit a formal request for transparency." Several homeowners nodded. Some whispered in agreement. The tide was turning. Margaret looked like she wanted to strangle me, but she didn't have a move left to play. I smiled. "Now, unless there's anything else, I think we're done here." Without waiting for a response, I gathered my papers and walked out. Margaret had started this war over a parking lot. Now she had a real problem on her hands. Margaret was cornered, and she knew it. The moment I walked out of that meeting, I could feel the weight of the neighborhood shifting. The homeowners weren't just annoyed with the HOA anymore, they were suspicious. And in a community where people paid hefty fees expecting everything to be above board, suspicion was a dangerous thing. I didn't go straight home after the meeting. Instead, I stopped by Tom's house. He had been on the HOA board for years, but unlike Margaret, he wasn't power-hungry. He had seemed genuinely unsettled by what I'd uncovered. When he answered the door, he looked like he hadn't fully processed what had just happened. He motioned me inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. We sat in his small but tidy living room, the hum of an old ceiling fan the only noise between us for a moment. I wasted no time. "You knew something was off, didn't you?" I asked. Tom exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "I suspected," he admitted. "Margaret has been controlling the financial reports for years. Every time someone asked too many questions, she dismissed it as standard administrative costs." "That's not an answer," I pointed out. Tom nodded, leaning forward. "No, it's not. And now that you've put it out in the open, she won't be able to dodge it anymore." I studied him for a moment. "You're not going to cover for her, are you?" His eyes hardened. "I have no loyalty to fraud. If she's been misusing HOA funds, I want to know just as much as you do." That was all I needed to hear. I pulled out my phone and sent him a file. "This is everything I pulled from public records. It's not a full picture, but it's enough to raise serious questions. If you can get access to the internal HOA financials, we'll know exactly what she's been hiding." Tom took his phone, scrolling through the documents. The further he read, the deeper his frown became. "This is bad," he muttered. "Really bad." I nodded. "She's been funneling money somewhere, and if we don't stop her, everyone in this neighborhood is going to pay for it." Tom exhaled, setting his phone down. "I'll call an emergency board meeting. A real one. Will demand a full audit." I stood up, satisfied. "Good, let me know when it's happening." As I walked back to my house, I could feel the shift in the air. Margaret had spent years manipulating this neighborhood, but now the walls were closing in. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Margaret didn't send any more notices, didn't try to tow Oliver's car again, didn't so much as glance in my direction when I passed her house. It was the kind of silence that only meant one thing: she was planning something. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Neighbors started stopping me in the street, asking questions, whispering about the financial discrepancies. Tom had apparently shared some of my findings, and the more people learned, the angrier they became. By the time the emergency board meeting rolled around, the community center was packed. More homeowners had shown up for this than any HOA meeting in recent memory. Tom sat at the front, looking calm but firm. Margaret, on the other hand, looked like a storm was brewing behind her carefully composed expression. Tom wasted no time. He stood up and addressed the room. "We're here today to discuss financial transparency within our HOA. he began. There are serious concerns regarding unexplained expenses, and as board members, it's our responsibility to ensure that every dollar collected from homeowners is properly accounted for. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands folded in front of her. This is unnecessary, she said. The financial reports are reviewed annually by the board, and there has never been an issue. Tom didn't even blink. Then you shouldn't have a problem providing a full breakdown of all expenses from the past 5 years. The room murmured in agreement. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. I will not be subjected to a witch hunt, she snapped. This is nothing more than an attempt to undermine my leadership. I leaned forward. If there's nothing to hide, then why are you fighting this so hard? She shot me a glare, but before she could retort, another board member, a woman named Linda, spoke up. I want to see the records, Linda said firmly, and I think the rest of the community does too. A wave of nods and murmurs swept through the room. Margaret's face darkened, but she was outnumbered. She couldn't stop this now. Tom cleared his throat. Then it's decided. We will conduct a full financial audit, and if any wrongdoing is found, we will take appropriate action. Margaret stood abruptly. I won't be part of this circus. She turned on her heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind her. No one stopped her. As soon as she was gone, Tom exhaled. All right. Let's get to work. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The audit revealed everything: misappropriated funds, fraudulent expense reports, even a secret slush fund Margaret had been using for personal expenses. When the final report was presented to the homeowners, the outrage was immediate. Margaret was removed from her position within the week. Formal charges were filed soon after. With her gone, the HOA underwent a complete overhaul. Tom took over as interim president, and one of the first things he did was reverse every ridiculous fine Margaret had imposed, including mine. The parking lot remained exactly as it was mine, free from HOA interference. Oliver continued working on his car without issue, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again, instead of Margaret's personal kingdom. As I stood in my driveway, watching Oliver tinker under the hood of his car, I couldn't help but smile. Margaret had tried to control everything, but in the end, she had lost everything instead. Margaret was gone, but the damage she had done to the HOA and the neighborhood lingered like the smell of burnt coffee. The audit had exposed more than just financial mismanagement. It had shattered the illusion that the HOA was an organization looking out for the homeowners. People were angry, not just at Margaret, but at themselves for letting her operate unchecked for so long. With Tom at the helm, things were changing quickly. The board was being restructured, and new policies were being drafted to prevent anyone from abusing power the way Margaret had. Homeowners who had been quiet before were now vocal about what they wanted: real transparency, fair rules, and an HOA that worked for them, not against them. I stayed out of most of the meetings after Margaret's removal. I had fought my battle, and I had won. The parking lot was mine, free from HOA interference, and Oliver could work on his car in peace. That should have been the end of it. But then, 3 weeks after Margaret vanished from community affairs, I got a call from Tom. His voice was strained, the kind of tone that told me something was wrong before he even got the words out. He asked if I could meet him at the community center. I agreed, curiosity outweighing my reluctance to get involved again. When I arrived, Tom was already there, pacing near the entrance. He looked up when he saw me, his expression serious. Inside, he led me to a table covered in papers. Documents, emails, and reports were spread out in a chaotic fashion, like someone had been trying to solve a puzzle without knowing what the final picture was supposed to look like. Tom explained that while the audit had uncovered Margaret's financial misdeeds, something else had come up, something bigger. The HOA had been involved in a series of questionable land deals over the years. Not just raised fees and misallocated funds, but actual property acquisitions that shouldn't have been legal. They had annexed small plots of land from homeowners under the guise of community maintenance agreements, slowly expanding their control over areas they had no right to. On paper, the homeowners had signed off on these deals, but there were discrepancies in the paperwork. Some signatures looked forged, dates didn't match up. Entire sections of agreements were missing from official records. Tom suspected that Margaret hadn't been acting alone. Someone else had been benefiting from these shady deals, and whoever it was had kept their name out of the spotlight. I wasn't surprised Margaret had been ruthless, but she wasn't the type to orchestrate something this sophisticated on her own. She had always been more about control and intimidation than financial schemes. Tom asked if I could help dig deeper. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had a knack for finding things people didn't want found. Over the next few days, I combed through every document Tom had collected. I looked at property transfers, meeting minutes, even old email correspondences from previous board members. And then I found it buried in the fine print of an old agreement from years ago. A name, Gerald Whitmore, Margaret's husband. He wasn't listed on any official HOA documents. He had never been on the board, never attended meetings. But his name kept appearing in obscure land agreements as a consultant for the HOA's property transactions. On the surface, it looked legitimate, but when I traced the payments, it became clear Gerald had been funneling money through third-party shell companies, slowly acquiring chunks of land and flipping them for personal profit. Margaret had been the face of the HOA's overreach, but Gerald had been the one turning it into a business. Tom was livid when I showed him the evidence. He had thought Margaret was the problem, but now it was clear she had just been one part of a much larger scheme. We had to act fast. Tom called for a homeowners meeting, one that would be open to every resident. This wasn't just an HOA issue anymore, this was fraud, and people needed to know. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. Word had spread quickly, and the air was thick with anticipation. Homeowners who had never cared about HOA politics before were now showing up, eager to hear the truth. Tom stood at the front, laying out everything we had found. The shady land deals, the forged signatures, the money trail that led straight to Gerald. People listened in stunned silence, the weight of the betrayal settling in like a heavy fog. Then the anger set in. Homeowners started shouting, demanding answers, asking how this had been allowed to happen for so long. Some had lost small pieces of their property to these fake agreements, never realizing they had been tricked. Tom assured them that legal action was already being prepared. The HOA would be filing a lawsuit against Gerald, and homeowners who had been affected would be able to challenge the fraudulent property transfers. Then, a voice from the back of the room cut through the chaos. Margaret. She had been sitting silently near the exit, watching everything unfold. Now she stood, her face paler than I had ever seen it. She didn't try to defend herself, didn't argue, didn't lash out. She just looked at Tom and me, then at the furious homeowners. And then she walked out. No one stopped her this time, but her silence spoke volumes. Over the next few months, everything changed. The lawsuit moved forward, and Gerald found himself in a legal battle that would cost him everything. The fraudulent land deals were overturned, and the HOA underwent a complete transformation. Tom stayed on as president, but with stricter oversight and a new board that prioritized homeowners' rights. Regulations were rewritten, and the HOA's power was dramatically reduced. As for me, I finally got my piece. The parking lot stayed mine, untouched and unchallenged. Oliver finished restoring his car, and the once hostile neighborhood finally started feeling like a community again. Margaret and Gerald had tried to control everything, but in the end, their greed had been their downfall. And I had made sure they never got the chance to do it again. With Gerald's fraudulent schemes unraveling and Margaret's influence completely shattered, the neighborhood finally felt like it was reclaiming itself. But the cleanup wasn't over yet. While legal action against Gerald moved forward, there were still lingering issues in the HOA's structure that needed fixing. Tom was staying on as interim president, but he had no intention of holding the position long-term. He wanted a full democratic election with safeguards in place to prevent another Margaret-like figure from taking control. The problem was, not many people were eager to step up. Years of Margaret's rule had left most homeowners either indifferent or distrustful of the HOA as a whole. At first, I stayed out of it. I had fought my battle and won. The parking lot was mine. Oliver's project car was untouched, and for the first time in years, I wasn't dealing with nonsense violation notices. But then Tom showed up at my house one evening, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't there to argue or guilt-trip me into anything. Instead, he laid things out plainly. If someone didn't take charge, the HOA would remain unstable. Without proper leadership, it risked getting taken over by opportunists who would exploit the chaos. The neighborhood needed someone who understood what had happened and wouldn't let history repeat itself. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I also couldn't ignore the truth in his words. If I wanted real, lasting change, I had to be part of it. So, after some consideration, I put my name in for the election. To my surprise, I wasn't the only one who had stepped up. Linda, the board member who had demanded financial transparency, also threw her hat in the ring. So did a younger guy named Marcus, who had just moved in a year ago and was passionate about keeping the HOA from ever becoming a dictatorship again. The election was held in the same community center where Margaret had once ruled with an iron fist. But this time, there was no intimidation, no arbitrary rule changes, just a straightforward vote. When the results were tallied, I won by a solid margin. Being HOA president wasn't something I had ever envisioned for myself, but I wasn't going to let the neighborhood down. My first act was to overhaul the bylaws, stripping away the ridiculous aesthetic fines and arbitrary vehicle restrictions. Homeowners would no longer be subjected to random fees based on personal vendettas. Any new regulations had to be voted on by the community, with majority approval. The second thing I did was push for an independent financial oversight committee. Never again would HOA funds be a mystery. Every expense would be accounted for, and any homeowner could request to see the financial records without resistance. With these changes, things started to shift in a way that actually benefited the community. People who had once dreaded HOA meetings now attended them voluntarily. Instead of complaints and fines, the discussions focused on real improvements, maintaining shared spaces, organizing neighborhood events, and ensuring that no one else could manipulate the system for personal gain. Gerald, meanwhile, was facing a growing legal battle. The fraudulent land acquisitions had been challenged in court, and several homeowners who had unknowingly lost property were finally getting their land restored. The lawsuit was ongoing, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. With Margaret out of the picture, he had no allies left to protect him. The most satisfying moment came a few months later, when I received notice that the fraudulent claims on some of the annexed properties had been formally reversed. Gerald had tried to claim ownership of small plots of land across the neighborhood, including a few that technically intersected with my parking lot. But now, all of those claims were nullified. On the day the final ruling came in, I stood in my parking lot, staring at the official notice in my hands. Oliver was there too, leaning against his fully restored car, a gleaming testament to everything we had fought for. Tom stopped by, watching as I pinned the notice to the newly installed HOA bulletin board. There, in bold letters, was the declaration that all fraudulent land acquisitions had been overturned. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not an overreaching HOA, not corrupt board members, and certainly not the Whitmores. As I stepped back and looked around, I realized something. We hadn't just won a fight against a corrupt HOA, we had taken back our community. And this time, we weren't letting it go.